This video is brought to you by my lovely patrons Thomas Johnston, James Rapp, Lewis, John Mezzo, Henry Kerr, Mike Rann, Karen Strauss, newcomer Tom Smarty, and a special thanks to Oscar Dursk and Rudbot for their contributions to today's video. For as little as $3 a month, you can get your name shouted out at the start of every Saw video, as well as access to bonus behind the scenes content. While I vividly remember Kevin Rudd coming to power in 2007, I don't really remember much about what he did in office. That was until a so-called controversial Labour-aligned comedian really exposed me to the job Rudd did in office, and really grew my appreciation of him. Combine this new appreciation with my recent election videos on Rudd, and I now feel confident to put our 26th Prime Minister in the spotlight. Before Rudd was the greatest handball master in Australia, he was a young boy growing up in the town of Nambour, Queensland, near the Sunshine Coast. Despite being the son of a Country Party member, Rudd would join the Labor Party in 1972, likely as a result of the Labor social programs that had supported him throughout his rough childhood. Rudd's rise to political fame would come in the late 80s when he'd become the campaign manager for Labor leader Wayne Goss's successful 1989 election victory. While the Queensland Nationals were practically unelectable following the Fitzgerald inquiry, Goss's win in 1989 was still an uphill battle due to Queensland's major gerrymandering problem. Thus Rudd deserves a lot of praise for pulling this win off. Rudd would go on to play a major role across the 7 years of Goss's government, eventually moving into federal politics in 1998 by winning the seat of Griffith. In 2001 he would enter the Shadow Cabinet as Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, where he would be responsible for crafting the opposition's stance on the War on Terror, which somewhat straddled the line between support and opposition for the Iraq War, and not something I particularly liked. However, this middle ground stance is what kept Rudd popular in the public eye, and allowed him to assume the role of opposition leader in 2006, and eventually lead the Labor Party to victory in 2007. Rudd's first major act as Prime Minister would be the apology to the stolen generations. And for those who complain that we should not be apologising for the crimes of our ancestors, I'd like to point out that Rudd's apology was made on behalf of the institution of government, and not Australians personally. Rudd would also move Australia towards a cleaner climate with pushes for renewable technologies. He would also push Australia into the digital age with the NBN, as well as his pledge to give every high school student a laptop, although I wouldn't get mine until my last year of high school in 2013. However, what really grew my appreciation to Rudd's time in office would be his economic policy. Soon after being elected, Rudd would remove Howard's horrible work choices policy. However, his bigger action would be his response to the 2008 global financial crisis. Rudd's economic response to the GFC would be one of the best in the world, and Australia would be one of the few nations to avoid a recession, and would enter the 2010s as one of the strongest economies in the world. Perhaps I'm being partisan when I say this, but comparing Rudd's 2008 response to the Morrison government's response to our current crisis really puts into perspective how ahead of his time Rudd was. It's not a shame that Rudd's time would unfortunately come to an abrupt end in 2010, when he was forced out by his own party. I personally put a lot of blame on Rudd's downfall on Australia's powerful private sector lobbyists, who hated Labor's large taxes on the mining industry, as well as other progressive policies which limited the power of Australia's biggest companies. However, I can't entirely blame lobbyists for what happened to Rudd, as his own bullish rule of the Labor Party was also a major factor that drove his own party to turn on him. Despite losing the top job, Rudd would continue on as Foreign Minister under Gillard, in which he would play a pivotal role in defining Australia's relations with its other nations, both near and far. Rudd would eventually drop out of this position to challenge Gillard in 2012, and would eventually become Prime Minister again in the waning years of the Labor government. However, his return to the top position would not last long, and he would be wiped out in the 2013 election before he could accomplish anything. Now let's go over to my patrons. Oscar Dursk says, Kevin Rudd has left an interesting legacy from his time as PM. He was a charismatic leader of the opposition, in the same vein as Bob Hawke or Gough Whitlam, who got swept into power only to be deposed in a single term by his own party. Still, in that short time he managed to do much more good than all 4 terms of his predecessor combined. He finally apologised to the stolen generation of Indigenous people for Australia's treatment of them. He signed the Kyoto Protocol, in the first of many steps in the right direction for Australia on carbon emissions. He introduced paid parental leave, which was crucial to helping parents deliver a better childhood for their children, and the national broadband network rollout began under his administration and would continue until Abbott stopped it in 2013. One of Rudd's biggest achievements was his government's management of the 2008 global financial crisis. Because of his government's stimulus, we managed to be one of the only nations in the world to avoid a recession. Wayne Swan, his treasurer, won the Best Treasurer award because of it, the second Australian to do so after Paul Keating. But although the people of Australia liked him as Prime Minister, many of his cabinet saw him as power-hungry and dictatorial, which led to his demise in 2010. While I have no problem with Julia in my opinion, the spill was a mistake and did not favour Labor's image. Even today you hear about how Labor is so unstable, even when it's not. We also have Ruddbot, who says, "Having grown up in a lower class household, I still remember the fear and panic that work choices brought about. The election of Kevin Rudd and his subsequent years in government felt like the most relaxed and happy my parents would ever feel, despite being fairly poor. Even with the widespread media coverage of his many debacles and scandals, the general opinion of Rudd, even in my national stronghold of a town, seemed fairly high, so it was a major shock when he was ousted like that. Despite the sheer amount of policy Gillard was able to enact, I feel as though Rudd's ousting was the worst thing the Labor Party could have ever done to themselves. Bringing back Rudd last minute was of course the second worst. Although I was not happy with another leadership change at the time, I am still proud to say that in 2013 my first ever vote was cast for Labor, and by extension for Kevin Rudd. Going over to YouTube, we also have the Mac and Cheese Orca, who says, "Kevin Rudd was an overall good leader. He helped Australia through the recession. However, he wasn't able to manage internal disunity." We also have Big Mac, who says, "Kevin Rudd is one of the best PMs of this century so far. I personally think he was popular and effective because he was different to any other Labor leader. He was from country Queensland, he didn't grow up in the trade union movement, and he was a self-proclaimed economic conservative." We also have Patrick Kenny, who says, "Kevin Rudd was the first Prime Minister I actually remember, and I personally think he's the best PM we've had in the 21st century. While he is certainly open to criticism when it comes to the way he led the Labor Party, I think his policies far outweighed those negatives. With his response to the GFC in particular being his stand-up policy, as it set the standard for what an economic stimulus should be, I also think some of his other policies such as the NBN, before the Liberals trashed it, beginning to formulate the NDIS, scrapping work choices and his various climate policies were also very solid, and his national apology speech was also great. I also believe the media's targeting of him towards the end of his term was a larger factor in his demise. Rudd also gets bonus points for being a great handball player along with his continued work in Australian politics." MG says, "Kevin Rudd to me represents the what could have been for Australia. I think it's hard to argue that if not for the Gillard turmoil, he would still be our Prime Minister today. The work him and Swan did during the GFC was simply outstanding, and his vision regarding mining royalties and the NBN is simply a missed opportunity. Australia lost a decade due to his absence and we are worse off for it." Finally, we have DM Productions, who says, "Kevin Rudd's legacy is overshadowed by his ousting within the party, and a great amount of his policies were prevented from implementation by both the left and right. Additionally, a large amount of his policies he proposed was never undertaken, so we never got to see how good of a Prime Minister he could have been. His response to the GFC has been hailed as the best response internationally despite his domestic reputation as the man who put Australia into debt. Environmentally, his attempts to implement the CPRS were prevented by the Greens and the Liberals, preventing Australia from having an ETS similar to Europe, and his attempts to reform the car industry were in vain following the Abbott government's cuts. Big Australia was never fully developed and could have greatly benefited Australia. As an individual person, he showed the capacity to lead following the Black Saturday bushfires and the Queensland floods while he was Foreign Minister. Kevin Rudd is the epitome of what if within Australian politics. I get the feeling from a lot of my audience that they feel like we never truly got to see the full extent of what Rudd could have accomplished in office had he not been undermined by Australia's powerful institutions and his own party. However, even if his leadership was cut short, he was still able to accomplish quite a bit and he remains a pivotal figure in both politics and in handball. Jokes aside, join me next time as we look at our 27th Prime Minister, Julia Gillard. Be sure to get your comments in on YouTube and Patreon within the next 2 weeks if you want to see them featured in my next video. Until then, I'll see you later.